Who are you? Where are you? What do you make?
Yeah, well, I'm a farmer's kid that got interested in alcohol as a teenager, decided to do a career in making wine. And so I make wine that tastes good to me. And in a nutshell, it's I have old world sensibilities, but I'm working with new world fruit. So just because we've got tremendous amounts and embarrassment of fruit actually potentially in our material, that doesn't mean we have to go to the max with that. We can actually make balanced, delicious wines that age well and go great with food.
So you said wines that taste good to you, and I know you to be somebody who has takes great pleasure in drinking widely across the world. Can you tell us a little bit about your palate, how it was formed, where it was formed, and the kind of wines that make you happy?
Well, what I really didn't drink anything fancy until my 20s, about 19 or 20 years old. Um, so we just drank the jug wine, Petrocelli and Fopiano and stuff like that. I'd have a glass or something like that. And but I do remember my father got he used to have an auto parts store in Healdsburg, and he got turned on to some German Riesling in 71 with the 71 vintage. Some customer of his said, "Hey, Ed, does your wife like wine?" And um, it's evidently a very good vintage in Germany, and even the cheap seats was really good. So I remember we had two different wines, two cases of each. One was a little sweeter than the other, but they were both amazing. I know, because they'd let me have a taste of stuff, and I went, "Holy shit, this is amazing!" You've got these floral layers to it, and acidity, and a little bit of sweetness to balance that. And we didn't drink very much of them. It took a couple of years to go through them, and they changed a little bit. So I remember that was the first experience with something in a 750 ml bottle, right? That tasted really good. But then at Fieldstone, André Tchelistcheff was our consultant, and we were very inexperienced. Even the winemakers there that I worked under over the 5 years that I was there were pretty inexperienced. So he would tell us what to do, but he also made us go out and purchase these benchmark old world wines. So we had some frame of reference. So when you talk about Chateau Latour or Gigal Hermitage or whatever, we'd actually tasted it before. It wasn't just all blah, blah, blah words. So that's where I started to really see, oh my God, this is really, really cool shit. And, that's what wine can be. So when I look at what we were doing locally in California, there were some people trying to do that a little more structured, higher acid, lower alcohol wines. But then, things started to change. But by then, my aesthetic thermostat was really well set. So I kind of ignored a lot of that stuff.
So Fred, that's a story I've heard reference to, but I've actually never heard the details. I just want to make sure I heard clearly.
Okay.
Andre made you go out and buy a bottle of Latour?
Well, he made Fieldstone. Yeah, go do that. Yeah.
Okay, so the winery went out and bought those wines for you, but quite literally, like the first growth, the top, the Latour, the top of the Rhone Valley.
Yeah.
Where were you buying those? Were they available locally?
I don't know. I was the cellar rat, so I just got to taste them. But what's interesting is that in such a small business, the cellar rat did all the stuff. I did lab work too, and anything that the winemakers felt that they was below them, I would do. So, but Andre was insisted on having me in on all blending trials and finding trials, things like that, because he thought having a wider range of palates was really good. And what's interesting is that he'd always ask me to speak first, and I didn't know any better, so I just say whatever was on my mind. And what was interesting is he always seemed to take the same opinion that I had, or at least we naturally had similar ideas. Not always, but most of the time it was pretty aligned. Anyway, somebody else, a sales manager or maybe the GM, would go buy the wines or order them. So I'm not sure exactly how we got them.
And then you would do roundtable tastings of them all together and sort of experience, or what was that process like?
Yeah, it was kind of like you guys sitting around there. We had a couple of things, a couple of Northern Rhones, and then we had what we were trying to do with Petite Syrah, and trying to be inspired by that, or with Cabernet. So yeah, we just sit around, taste the stuff, talk about how's our stuff like or different from it. So I just thought that was a great opportunity, to taste something, and I've actually taken that to heart. With I've got a bunch of Northern and Southern Rhone wines in my cellar and German Rieslings and stuff like that. So and we don't drink them that often. So what I've started to do is a tasting group with some of the youngers in the industry who never would have that opportunity. Have them come over, we taste them blind, talk about them, and then unveil them, and it gives me an excuse to open them and taste them, and it leverages that asset hugely, because I think, if these youngers never get a chance to taste these things, they can't have a good frame of reference.
Did Andre give you, in that context, was he the sort of person who was a teacher who would walk you through, well, if you're tasting, did he tie them to winemaking techniques for you? What was the learning process with him around those wines?
There were two things. One, he wanted us just to have the frame of reference, and the other one, he would be talk about the techniques a little bit. And some of them, it was a real stretch, quite honestly. Like when we taste Côte Rôtie, they'd have Syrah with a little Viognier often, and so he was trying to make the jump with us with our Petit Syrah, 100-year-old Petit Syrah vines, and co-fermenting with a little Chenin Blanc, kind of as a similar sort of inspiration. So they weren't exactly parallel, but it opened my mind to the fact that, oh God, you can add, at that time I didn't know that you'd mix a little white with your red in your fermentations. So, to me that was like, wow, this is cool.
Cool. I do have to say on the way by, and I think it's worth for everybody, that my experience blending with you when I've been at the winery and you were doing blending trials and pulling samples, and I have told everybody who I've ever told the story to, is that you are so interested in how people taste that you made me feel like I knew what the hell I was talking about, where we're sitting and talking, but you're really interested in, okay, my take, what's the blend? And it's a piece of inclusion. And I've never heard you tell the Andre story, but it sounds exactly like you.
Well, it seems like a good way to go.
I certainly enjoyed it.
Yeah. No, it's, and when I'm doing blending trials, I have an idea what the wine should represent, right? It should represent where it comes from. Now, it can be stylistically focused, right, through the lens that whoever the producer is, or which neighborhood they're in within an AVA. But the wine should reflect what it is that you're claiming it to be on the label.
So you've got some Riesling under your belt. You've got some classics under your belt. You're at Fieldstone. When do you start? When do you move into your role as sort of a professional, full-on winemaker?
In a couple years. I left Fieldstone when I was 23 and ended up at Greenwood Ridge Vineyards. They needed a winemaker and vineyard manager, and I was able to muddle through both. It was a little place that was quite remote, and it was a great opportunity. Nobody really wanted to live up there because it was relatively remote. And I thought it was perfect. I got to do a little of this, a little of that. I was still kind of over my head. I didn't have a lot of experience. I was only 23 or just almost 24. But I had more experience than most everybody else, I guess, that applied for the job. So it took a few years of muddling my way through that stuff. I wish I had another opportunity to work with Riesling again, because that Riesling fruit was so fantastic there. It was really special, and I didn't have the experience to really do justice to it. But and I've talked to Judy about it, who says, do nothing new, no fucking things new, okay? But she said, well, maybe Riesling, but I don't think I'm going to fall for that. I'll enjoy Riesling grown in places where it's been for a long time, and from people who are very experienced with it. Same with champagne and sparkling wine. I made one once, and I never worked so hard to make such a mediocre product. So, it's fine. I'll let others enjoy that experience. So, it's been a while. I'd say about the time I got to Dehlinger, it was quite a collaboration. At that time, Tom Dehlinger, in '88, he hired me, and he hired a vineyard manager. And the vineyard manager has a little bit of winemaking experience. I had, some viticulture experience. Tom had been doing both. And so it was a great kind of a triad of perspectives and stuff. Now, Tom was a very analytical, methodical kind of person, and he didn't he wouldn't fall for something. He'd say, well, I kind of feel this, or I kind of think that that hippie bullshit didn't fly with him. You had to have you had to have a plan, or at least you had to prove it. And you would do some experiments. So we did lots of experiments. I loved that, because, we would learn from doing that. So we took a whole fresh look at everything we were doing, and it paid off hugely, both in the vineyard and in the winery. We were doing some retrofitting of the trellis system on much of the vineyards there. They had excessive vigor in parts of it. And like what the row would go from a richer soil, and then it would go up on this hillside that was leaner, and then it would really, really lean hilltop, and then back down the other side into richer soil. But the same trellis would go through the whole thing. And you needed to have a little more light getting in to the more vigorous parts. So modifying the trellis made a lot of sense. Now, I advocated doing a lyre system or a split system in the vigorous areas, and then changing as we go up the row, because we had such beautiful perfumes and stuff in the old California sprawl on the leaner soils. So we had just the right amount of shading. The fruit wasn't beamed all day long. The Pinot Noir fruit in particular wasn't beamed with sun all day. And but the more vigorous areas needed to have a lot more, they needed to have more shoots growing so they wouldn't grow as vigorously, and to kind of spread the wealth, and then also to be able to get more sunlight and air through the whole canopies. So what we ended up doing was picking rows and doing the entire row with this stuff. It was sort of a compromise. And I felt like we overexposed the hilltop parts with that. But the net result overall was definitely a positive. So anyway, that's an example of the kind of collaboration that we went through. We looked at equipment, pressing, bottling equipment, whether to sparge the headspace in your Chardonnay with argon before you cork it or not, or whether the vacuum corking was even necessary, so on and so forth. So it was very interesting. And we took a look at filtration. They started in 75, and it was all unfined, unfiltered kind of stuff. And then it was a 79 Zinfandel and the 81 Petite Syrah had tiny bits of residual sugar left in them. They had, both of those vintages, they just had maybe stuck fermentations or something in one of the lots. And they ended up with, I think at Cordy Brothers in Sacramento, they had some wine stored there. It was a little bit warm, and the stuff got tiny bit fizzy, just a little bit active. And boy, that was devastating, to them. Just in their minds, like, oh my God, our wines aren't even going to be stable. Nobody's going to want them. So they hired somebody who had experience doing sterile filtration, or at least, enologically, cleaning out the wines. And there was consequences to that. You removed a lot of colloidal material, and you felt maybe you had safety, but you lost something. So I thought we should revisit all of they had done some filtration trials, but they weren't actually done properly. They didn't do proper controls on the unfiltered or less filtered parts. And, I had experience as a home winemaker as a teenager. So I knew how to really handle 5-gallon jugs of stuff really carefully. And so we redid all that stuff. And what we ultimately found is that filtration, if you do all your cellar work with making filtration unnecessary, you can bottle these things without filtration. So we embarked on that a little gently, and it just so happened that I started my brand in '91. That's about the time that we were seeing proof, after 3 years of doing these experiments. So I was able to put my money where my mouth was and bottle the first vintage without finding or filtration. And I remember my boss, Tom Dehlinger, says, okay, we'll see how wedded you are to this whole thing. I said, dude, I'm totally on it. So no worries. He says, you're putting your whole nut on that. And I go, yeah, I feel confident about this. I think we've got the information that we need, and haven't looked back. We don't make a big deal about the fact that we don't fine or filter the wines. I find one wine. It was 2 barrels of Black Lightning, 2008. That was that Pinot Noir that got smoke affected. And the new wood actually healed itself, but the two of the older barrels just had a hardness to them. And so 1 egg white per barrel was just enough to round that out. And it had been so long since I'd find a wine, I had to go pull up my notes to remember how to prepare the egg white solution. You do a saline kind of thing with the egg whites. But that was something we used to do all the time. It was, I know I'm bouncing around here, but back in the 70s and 80s, pretty much, the gestalt was in wineries was you run it through your process, you just grind it on through your standard procedure, and then you fix things. Then you do your blending or your finding trials, and what are you going to add to the wine to take the shit out that you had too much in there. And I looked at all this and I'm thinking, if you just don't get that in there, then you don't have to take it out, and you're doing less to the wine. So that's why I look at the macerating to appropriate amount of time and doing my pressing, jus de presse thing so rigorously, because it makes everything else easy. It totally balances and fine tunes the wine, and then you're done messing with it. You just put it in the right kind of barrels and give it the right conditions to let time become an ingredient or a factor.
Do you want to underline here, because these are things I hear you say, because I've been fortunate enough to talk and listen and learn from you for 20 years. But I have a very hard time communicating quite how important your the intentionality and the slowness of your process is, because it's taken me a long time in watching other wineries and other winemakers figure out the impact on the wine. And you can pour the wine and people can love the wine, and that's you can pretend that that's enough for the sale. But I just wonder, and maybe Alex, you have thoughts here too, but I just wonder, like, how do we better communicate in a succinct way the essence of your proactive, preemptive thoughtfulness, which shows in the wines, but if you haven't spent 20 years working on it, I don't know that you know how to taste it per se.
I guess the analogy, the best analogy would be somebody's cooking something. How long are you going to leave the steak on the grill or the skillet? You're looking at it, and for like timing of things. And then if you're balancing a sauce or something, you're adding things. You're let's say you're just titrating in a little bit of salt or something, or lemon juice or some other angular sort of thing. You add a little bit, taste it, go a little bit more. You don't just measure it out and not taste it. You got to taste it and get it all right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's Alex, can you help clarify or help us think about it?
Yeah, I think there's an intentionality. It's a really big thing to highlight. And just to juxtapose it with the fix it and post mentality of a lot of wine these days, where it's, people are thinking more about cash flow than they are about the quality of the wine. And there's a lot of this, like, let's just fix it later and work fast and release as soon as possible. Where the time as an ingredient mentality doesn't work, is not built into like how they're thinking. So highlighting that operating with this intentionality is really, unfortunately, rare these days. I think it's important because it's easy to in tasting it, like, right, if you don't know this, it's easy to just say, wow, these wines are amazing, and glance over the time and conscious effort that's put into working this way.
I really like the phrase time as an ingredient. I think that's very communicative in a way that we maybe haven't used. Fred, is there an additive or a something or rather that would save you the most time if you chose to use it? And I'm just looking for a counterpoint. So if time is an ingredient, if you didn't put the time in, what would you put in to achieve the Alexander Valley 2018 Cabernet?
I don't think there is anything, especially time in the bottle. There's reactions that only happen there. I don't think you can get stuff from a bag or a box. There's a catalog this thick probably with all the shit you can add, but I don't read it. because there's stuff you can add, and then you add another thing to take out the extra stuff that got in there from the first stuff that you added, and you can do this and do that. And I don't know, it seems to me that it's actually less work to just slow down a little bit when you're handling the wine, like pressing it. It's only a day, right? Or part of a day. I'm already messing with this stuff. I'm already moving it and pressing it. So I've only added a couple hours of my focus, when you really look at that, because I turn the press up a little bit with a little thing, and I can go do other stuff. I'm not sitting there holding the valve trying to keep the pressure the same. I buy this little $25 pressure regulator, put it in line, and turn it up to what it is, and then come back and visit it after a while. Or later in harvest, I'm taking a little nap in the afternoon, after I take one fraction, and I was like, okay, I got to go, just let my mind rest a little bit and come back after it's done doing it. So it's really not that much extra time out of my day. Does that make sense? Because I can do other stuff while the press is doing its thing. It just seems to make so much sense to not hurry to finish that process. I know so many wineries, they're trying to be efficient. The press programs will run 90 minutes and you're all done, right? And then you can throw another one in there, and you got another one queued up, and it's great efficiency. I don't have to be that efficient.
This is a moment to remind the sales team, if they don't know, they probably don't, but the press that you mentioned, is that still the press that you purchased and then took apart entirely to rebuild the motor so that it would run slower and meet your expectations of how fast it works?
That's actually the destemmer. And I just had the motor rewound. It's a 3-phase motor. So, you can drop the RPMs by a third and still have enough torque to do what I had to do, because I'm not trying to jam a lot of stuff through it. And that allowed me, with the variable speed pulleys on it, to spin the destemmer slowly enough that when the Zinfandel comes along, I can spin it slowly enough that I can get rid of the maximum amount of raisins and green stuff with the stems, because they tend to stay stuck onto the stems a little more thoroughly than the dead ripe stuff. So if I can catch that speed where I don't feel like I'm wasting too much of the good stuff, but I'm getting rid of as much of the noisy ends of the bell-shaped curve as possible, then that's a trade-off. In some vintages, it's a steep bell-shaped curve. In others, it's really, really flat. So, I think that's, for our Zinfandel, that's been a critical factor in refining that style. We're getting some of the perfumes from, you're going to get a few of the raisins in there a little bit, but that kind of gives perfume. But too many of them, now you start seeing the stewed fruits and actual raisin character. And the same with the greener stuff. You're going to get that hard tannins from the seeds and just the extra angles. So if you run it slowly enough, you can get rid of the noise to the point where you can actually see the middle part, which is the best part. And it's not just one. There's a little bit of an array, right? You get the red fruits and then little darker fruits and blue fruits and stuff like that. But it's just a way to refine the incoming material. So that's the thing that I had the motor rewound to run slower than it was designed. Or it was designed for 50 hertz, and we push them at 60, and they put the same motor in it. So we're actually running 20% faster. So by dropping it by a third, I'm only running 12 or 13% slower than it was designed. So it's not that big of an alteration, but it's enough. Now the presses, I bought, my first one was from Switzerland, and it's a Vilnius WP type design, but it happened to be from Suter. Built it, same specs, basically it takes the same bladder, it's just the frame is different. So I got that and used, and it was a nice press. I didn't buy that on purpose. I actually couldn't afford the programmable press that I'd been using for years elsewhere. So and I'd worked with these WPs before, and I could afford it. And I was able, rather than a basket press, I could do a whole cluster pressing of Chardonnay and rosé in it. So that drove my choice there. And I'm so glad I got those, because they're pretty manual. There's a brake and a button for going forward, and then there's a valve to let air in and a valve to let air out. And So they're pretty manual, and that's great because I've learned so much about pressing by having to be there and thinking about what's going on. So the whole cluster pressing of Chardonnay and rosé that's labor intensive. So I trained somebody else. I trained Ryan to do it this year, my son, and try to explain to him, think about what's going on in here. How's the load? How's it balanced when we're rolling berries off of stems, right? And push on them pretty hard. Give them a good push. Look how much it rains. Don't be wedded to what the pressure is. Look at what's happening, and that's worked out really great for that. But what's really, and now I have 2 of those presses because I can get maybe 3 tons of red pomace in there, and some of my fermenters would hold 5 tons. So rather than doing 2 separate things, because I want to do it in parallel with the blending trials, if I have 2 presses, it'll hold 6. Potentially, I can put 2.5 in each, and then I can run parallel pressings and blending trials with it. And it's also a backup if one of them breaks. I still have something to keep going. In the worst case scenario, and that's happened. But what the other thing that I hadn't expected with these type of presses, when I press my reds so slowly, we're talking an hour and a half to 2 hours of going between, say, 3 and 4 psi, right? And to get 15 or 20 gallons of pressed wine in the pan, or that next fraction. But because it's taking so long, I'm getting a huge amount of evaporation and oxygen contact. I mean, it's all saturated with oxygen, which is fine. But I'm getting a lot of evaporation, and the alcohol is disappearing faster than the water. So my press fractions, it's actually like a de-alcoholization thing, inadvertently. And what I found is that by the time I finish pressing something, depends on how many fractions it takes and how long it's, got pressed stuff sitting around in the pan and around the edge of this slotted screen, evaporating, I can lose up to 1% of alcohol in that wine from the free run, or sampled out of the tank versus what's in my press. Usually I lose about 0.5% or 6 or 7 tenths. It kind of depends, but usually around 0.5% at the least. So just like when you're dealing with distilled spirits and diluting it a little bit with water, it changes the relative volatilities of things. Your congeners will pose themselves differently. It can make, I think that it's not just stuff that's coming out of the press, it's the fact that the alcohol level is changing a little bit, that it's can make red fruit pop a little bit more, or something will seem plummy and a little chalky on the tannins. And then the next fraction is like, wow, the red fruit popped. It actually doesn't have a little sense of heat, and the tannins aren't chalky anymore, and it's more seamless and mouth-watering. And then maybe the next fraction after that takes it, even further in a positive direction, or maybe it just makes it a little too hard on the finish now. So it's fascinating to me to see it's like a 3-dimensional balancing act of all these things coming in equilibrium. I mean, I'm trying to catch everything when they get to that focal point in the middle before they get diffuse. Does that make sense? It's kind of like an hourglass sort of a graph mentally. Did that make any sense?
Yeah.
So it does, and I will also just chime in here for everybody listening that talking to you as always is the same thing, where there's so many layers to conversations with you about wine. This is quite literally why Ask a Winemaker started, because you gave me all of this information out of Harvest. And I remember trying to keep up and I couldn't. And I say that just to highlight to everybody here that this is an opportunity to listen, to go back and go back again and go back again, because there's a master winemaking class in this. And ask Alex. Alex is the best resource here for us to lead into. The other thing, Fred, and again, just for everybody, if time is the ingredient, your patience and knowledge is the thing that we need to wrap our head around presenting and how we talk about it, because it is, when people understand it, they start to see it. And before that, they might not. But so in the interest of time, because as always, I could talk to you all day. I thought maybe we'll switch to tasting, and if you could use the wines as we go through one at a time to tell us the story of the wine, but also frame a little bit the wine in the context of your potentially family history, your own history. And here to start out, we're looking at the 2019 Scherrer Vineyard Chardonnay.
Okay. Well, that Chardonnay, we put Chardonnay in the 80s, and it actually was planted. The original block was Chenin Blanc, planted in 82. We planted that for Gallo, and then in 1985, when they were beginning to bear, Gallo didn't want Chenin Blanc from Alexander Valley anymore. So my dad had heard that Chardonnay was kind of something that we might be doing, and I'd worked with a vineyard in Mendocino County, actually Redwood Valley, the Lalonis Vineyard. I had custom crushed a small amount of their fruit for a client, and that I was struck that that site reminded me of this place. You know, you look up in the hills; it was kind of at the foot of the hills, and the trees and stuff were the same. The dust smelled the same, and I thought, you know, this Chardonnay does really well here. Maybe I should turn Dad onto it. So I got him and Ulysses Lalonis hooked up. So my dad went and got some budwood and grafted over, and then we planted another block, another couple acres, which is what I'm working with now. We don't know what the clone is. It's got a mild leaf roll virus infection, and that's good and bad. It's good for the quality of the wine in the site because it doesn't make sugar very fast, and it doesn't respire acidity very quickly. If we had clean plant material, we probably would have pretty flabby stuff at higher alcohol. But as it turns out, everything seems to be in sync for this climate, and it makes, I think, pretty rock and chard for this area. You know, it's actually leaner, presents itself as much leaner than the Helfer Chardonnay from Russian River Valley, which is actually a cleaner plant material in a colder area. Winemaking is pretty simple, you know, hippie style. I have whole cluster press it, ferments in barrels. There's some new ones, there's old ones. I try to keep it, you know, south of 50% new. I do like some of the new oak in there, and it's been an evolution of what kind of barrels I've used. It's all been French oak, but as far as with the Cooper, and I've settled into a hideously expensive barrel that is, I think, absolutely perfect for what I'm trying to do, which is to support the wine and not to see that it's been in some new barrels, or, you know, in a proportion of new barrels. But I really do like the way that the barrel helps with the texture of the wine and brings some non-fruit elements into play. So this is indigenous fermentations, both alcoholic and malolactic. It's about 2 years. This one was probably a year and a half in barrel before bottling. But I'm pushing it pretty close to 2 full years.
What does the extra time in barrel do?
Well, basically, the yeast turn back into wine. They leak out stuff and they dissolve back into the wine. So you end up with some umami kind of characters getting back in there, and the amazing textural stuff that happens. But I think that second year, you're getting some really great non-fruit elements. And that's not a euphemism for stinky things. That's just, you know, interesting peptide sort of stuff, and you know, just interesting, pleasant attributes to the wine. So it's not all just Johnny 1 or 2 note.
We're on the tail end of the 19. We have the 21 Chardonnay on the way. Could you give us a little preview of what to expect as far as differences in expression? Yeah,
it's actually quite similar. It's a little more flashy, I think, texturally, because I think that was a full 24 months. I wish that I hadn't sold all the 20 to Canada, because the 20 is just a stunning electric vintage. I think it's exceptional, despite what people say about smoke and all that kind of bullshit. You know, not everything got affected, but I'd say the 21 and the 19 are more similar. Just it's a little flashier.
Right, guys, any questions on the Chard beyond?
What is your Bâtonnage regime, if at all?
I do a little bit maybe at the end of fermentation to kind of encourage the yeast to finish the job. And then after that, it's like nothing.
Yeah.
You know, maybe I'll make an SO2 edition, depending on when the SO2 edition is. If it's really late in the game, I don't want to stir up the lees. I'll just kind of stir it into the wine in the top and let it kind of work its way through. But I'm not into extended bâtonnage. You know, I played around with it a little bit, but no, it's just leave it alone. I've done that with reds once in a while. You know, if we have vintage, let's say we get a real heat spell or something, and we pick them on the early side and the tannin's just a little bit hard, I'll experiment with bâtonnage with that. And I'll, stir a couple of barrels here and there. And then a couple of days later, I come through and spin it down in the lab centrifuge and compare it to one, a similar type barrel that I didn't stir, and ask myself, did this move the wine in the direction that I want? If it does, I'll stir more of them, but I don't stir them all. And I found that having that diversity is actually better than doing the one thing or the other, if I end up stirring lees in anything at all. But with the whites and the rosé as well, that's really not my thing. Yeah.
Moving here to the 2024 rosé, which is the first time I've tasted it.
Yeah, beginning in 2020, I've added Zinfandel to the mix. For about a decade, it was Grenache and Syrah. Prior to that, it was everything that I had, Zinfandel and Pinot Noir. I found that if I did Zinfandel and Pinot Noir together, it would cancel some of the overt fruitiness of each of the varieties, which is fascinating. One year I had 5 rosés. I think I had a Cab and 2 Pinots and a Zin and a blend, and it was crazy. But I really honed into making it simpler. So I think that Grenache and Syrah are a great base. But in 2020, I lost almost all the Syrah because of the smoke had affected the Syrah vineyard that I was working with for this. And I got little bit of Syrah. So then I walked on the grapes and let them macerate overnight to get a little more of that Syrah character in there, kind of a Syrah concentrate, if you will. But I added some Zinfandel. I thought our Zin would maybe balance that Grenache similar to the way the Syrah did, but it didn't. It was much more like the Grenache structurally. But what it brought to the whole blend was kind of a hibiscus thing that wasn't just in the Zin and it wasn't just in the other stuff. The combination, it brought another element. And I go, oh, shit, I got to keep doing this. So I grab a little bit of our Mature Vine Zinfandel and, vinify that as well. And this last year, I drew from an area that I haven't worked with for 20 years. Since Gala quit buying fruit, we had the whole vineyard to draw from. I did find a buyer for most all of it, but I took more of the area as much as I could handle in our winery. And that rosé is just fucking amazing all by itself. So I'm telling Judy, I could see making a rosé just out of that stuff. It's not quite the same as this, but what I love about this rosé is this is the kind of rosé I love to drink. It's probably the one wine that we drink more often than anything, practically every damn day. To my taste, the 23 is in the zone. It's everything's kind of melded and molded perfectly, but this 24 is pretty exciting. It's brash. It's got that really bright salivary response going on. And the recipe is very similar. It's 50 to 60% Grenache seems to be the sweet spot. And then the remaining 50 or so percent was, Zinfandel and Syrah in nearly equal proportions. So I vinify them all separately, do blending trials to see what it is I need to kick out, how can I improve this by lifting something out. Most vintages, I have to lift something out, and I'll find I have an excess of maybe Syrah, or one year in 23, I had an excess of Grenache, which was amazing on its own. So just a different expression of rosé. So I sometimes will create another cuvée, but this is the main thing that I'm shooting for, and I know what it should be. I try to get the proportions as close to what I think it ought to be, so that I don't necessarily have to create another thing, but I'm quite happy to create another bottling if that's the way to shuffle everything around to optimize every bottle. It's got a screw cap. I did experiments with closures with all of our wines. I used to be able to rent a screw capping machine. A local company, I'd drive, half an hour to go pick up the machine. I'd pick it up on a Friday, wire it into my plugs, defeat all the safety devices so I could actually operate it at a reasonable speed, and then put it back to the way that they gave it to me and bring it back to them on Monday. And they charged me $200, for one day. And that worked for a few years, but then the damn drug dealers said, okay, well, the first one's free. Now you got to buy it. We're not renting anymore. And I couldn't go back. The rosé absolutely adores the screw cap relative to cork. My other wines don't. So I bought the machine, and now it's more convenient. I don't have to drive to the place or defeat all the stuff. I've modified it so it runs at reasonable rates, still safely. And I wish all my wines preferred a screw cap, but I don't want to change the winemaking to make it fit the closure. Screw cap's like 13 or 14 cents, whereas my corks are about $1.
Wow.
And then, when we used to use capsules, that's a quarter right there. So you got $1.25 for your closure and decoration. So, I can see why inexpensive wines are put up with screw caps, because it's less expensive. But I think it's a great closure for certain wines.
So one thing with the rosé, which I think is really important for us to think about and do better with, this is not priced to be a rosé for 99% of the places that sell rosé by the glass, maybe even 99.9%, but it is made to really shine in a spot that can sell good wine, whether it be pink, white, or red. I think that it's something we need to think really carefully about presenting with hooks in a menu, so that you have somebody that is ordering something and you're selling a bottle for a table, where the staff can see that it works very well with specific foods, and you can see right away that, especially on the 24, where we're moving into a different acidity, my mind goes right away to the place we might have gone to for dinner tonight, Sushi-san, where you're going to say, bring in raw fish, bring in ginger and sort of high toned flavors in a way that we haven't done before. So I say that partly just to put the flag down, but for everybody to think about selling this, it's not it's probably not a by the glass. If it is a by the glass, you're going to sell a ton of it because people are going to get behind it.
Mhm.
But it's one where if you can get it on a list and then taste it with the staff and get the staff behind it based on specific pairings, then you have a table going, oh, that's delicious, and the bottle's gone. So, Fred, do you have any other thoughts on selling it or presenting it, or things you've seen that work?
What I found is it's just been frustrating that I spare no expense to make one of the best domestic rosés. I really attempt to, and then people go, yeah, I love it, but I can get cheaper rosé. I go, yeah, but then it'll taste like fucking cheaper rosé too. That response, well, it's all about price. It's like, well, you got Burgundy on your list, and you can get cheaper Pinot Noir from other places for most of these that taste better. But you're selling expensive stuff. So I don't know. It's a curious thing. Rosé gets treated. It's like a racism thing, It's got a whole different sort of thing going on. There's only 2 great rosés in the world, and everything else is second class wine. That makes sense?
Totally.
You're saying that Angelina Jolie makes one of the world's great wines?
I was at Kapalua Wine and Food Festival probably not long after they came out and they launched that Miraval, and I happened to be I was pouring at my station, had rosé along with theirs in this thing, and people had asked me, well, which one should I have? And tell me about these. I said, well, this is made by famous people, and this is made by somebody not famous. And they go, well, which is better? And I said, well, the one that's not by, or mine, of course. But I said, you should taste them both, and you decide which is better.
Yep. Very cool. Next up, are we doing Syrah? What do we have open here?
Yeah, we've got Sasha might be a fun place to go.
Yeah, so we did the dinner last night that went very well, and what I really liked was that Chef Madeline and Alex came to the decision to pour the Sasha Syrah before the Pinot and before the Zin. which if we are considering, and I really want to highlight for the team, you have to check every instinct you have about what a California red wine is, because every instinct you have is probably saying, California Syrah is big and dark and whatever it is. Based on, and not even what you have, but what your buyer's instincts are. What Madeline noticed is that it is so much lighter, you put it first, and if there's a reason it's a lighter. And Fred, if you talk us through that sort of the hows and whys, but I just love that they picked that up and saw that themselves.
Me too. Yeah, me too. Well, they're tasting with their palate, not just, doing what they think is the normal thing that should be done. The Sasha to me is it's a proprietary name for the prettier side of Syrah, and essentially most of this is probably rosé grapes, stuff we farmed for rosé and picked for rosé that was maybe the little riper part of the block, little smaller berries, a little more even, that tasted really good, and so then we would divert that and make some red wine out of it. So there's a crispness to it, a little red fruits, herbal kind of stuff, and I just think it's Syrah is a gorgeous grape in all of its aspects. You can go from profound to pretty and amazing rosés. So it's just such a versatile, useful grape.
Can you explain what it means to farm something for rosé and why that makes a difference to the etherealness of this wine?
Yeah, well, typically what I look at is rosé. A vineyard with destiny as rosé is probably got a richer soil, so it wants to grow more, it wants to make more of a crop. So let it. You're not trying to ripen that material to the point of the tannins being mature, et cetera, for red wines. You just need to get that juice gorgeous. You get it to that ripeness level that's going to be great for rosé. And you're not looking for a lot of concentration. You're looking for pretty. So, particularly with Calypso Vineyard, he had a huge variation within that. It's a 3-acre vineyard, and there was this huge variation. So, some parts were definitely destined for rosé, and then part of it could go either way depending on the vintage. So we would kind of look and see, is it an early start? Maybe we'll make a little lighter red, maybe thin it a little bit more. But it's essentially the more well-endowed parts of your vineyard, I think, have a better destiny as rosé. So go ahead, let the vine have a little bit more fruit on it, and then we'll pick it earlier and press it, make some gorgeous rosé. So the Sasha can come from something that's kind of destined that way, and then I have some other things that maybe have a little more richness to them that I can blend in to get everything right. So it's nice having different elements around to fine tune things by creating that committee.
Yeah. Also very important as you're presenting that idea of being specifically understanding the idea of the rosé farmed differently to produce something different in the bottle is an angle for describing. So you set somebody up to expect something a little bit different as opposed to something a little bit bigger. I think is a very useful bit of language to invest and try to use.
I think that's a great strategy, because if somebody thinks that, well, why isn't this a big, bold Syrah? What went wrong? It's like, no, this is everything went right. That's what this thing's supposed to be,
Yeah, I think that by definition, so we talk a lot about making sure you're selling a specific wine and you have a plan to sell that wine as opposed to just showing somebody something. I think if you are walking into a tasting with somebody who wants a big, bold Syrah, you haven't done your homework. And that's part of what this call is about, to say, you're going to walk in and you're going to set somebody up who's going to tell you they don't necessarily like big, bold, New World Syrah. And the answer is, neither do I. Let's taste Fred's. So very important for the flow on that. Do you want to Corbin the kick? Or
we should do that way later.
Pinot first?
Yeah.
2016 Russian River Pinot Noir.
Okay. So that's our main Pinot Noir. We treat it as though it was our estate Pinot, even though we don't grow Pinot Noir ourselves, but it's one of the meat and potatoes wines. I work with the same blocks for, oh my goodness, 20 years or so. And what I'm looking for is to have something that really channels the average vibe of Russian River Valley, kind of a dark cherry cola thing. There's kind of a generosity to it, but because it's one of our wines, it's got that upward trajectory, that salivary response. You know, instead of finishing somber, it finishes on an upward trajectory.
The upward trajectory is a phrase that I think is really important, and it's one that I heard in a very similar way, describing Pinot Noir, or pardon me, describing Spätburgunder, sitting with Klaus-Peter Keller in the Rheinhessen, where he said, and forgive my butchering it, but he said, "It is the red Riesling. It has the kick in the end." And what he went on to say about the kick in the end is talking about Riesling, talking about Pinot Noir. He said, we really like these wines that have the lift, and we want to have wines that make you want to open the second Magnum. And I've always loved that idea, and channeling the idea of acidity that's going to give you lift to focus people on the fact that your mouth is clean and you want more. In a sales setting, to just drop in the idea of upward trajectory, especially for a younger buyer, you can do a little bit of education, so you get somebody looking for the right thing in their mouth, and you're also letting the new buyer go, like, they'll taste something else and they'll be like, oh, it doesn't have that upward trajectory. And if you taste with them a little bit more, no matter who the buyer is, you can use the Keller kick in the end thing, because it's kind of an easy light one, but it really does clue in the buyer to what we want the wine from our book to be showing, because it's such a universal thing that, like, wines that don't have the kick in the end you don't open the second bottle, much less finish the first glass. And I think you can think about that and use that in language for somebody where you're talking about a glass pour, especially here, because we're talking about a situation where you guys have made the glass pour available to us for the 2016, pointing out the kick in the end for somebody to say that kick in the end is going to sell you a second glass, right? And so it's something that we identify that we like, but has a very specific commercial value that needs to be front and center, to lead a horse to water effectively, right? Alex, you make Pinot. Thoughts on Pinot here? Questions on Pinot? How do you think about this as you taste it? And
Yeah, I mean, it's such a magical wine to have in the bag when you have something that has that you're catching it at that perfect moment of development, where you have the balance of the fruit with the more secondary and tertiary flavors. It's just such fun to share with people, and the response is there. There is sometimes this all of Fred, all of your Pinots elicit this conversation, but there's this idea that California Pinot doesn't age, and these just blow people out of the water with that, and it's just so much fun to share.
Thanks. Yeah, it's funny, 5 years and the wine should be dead, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily true.
Truly.
the Zinfandel. So this is the 1819 Zinfandel. Tell us the story of Zinfandel, the origin story, and what the wine is.
Well, the name was actually coined by my Uncle Mario. He was an Italian guy from Calistoga. He married my mom's younger sister, and he didn't like red wine. believe it or not, there was an Italian guy that didn't like red wine, and that was Mario. So he said, well, when I was a teenager making wines at home, he said, Freddie, quit making that goddamn Zinfandel. Make something good like Muscadoodle, because he likes sweeter stuff, you know, apricot brandy. And, you know, he had an awesome recipe for Manhattans that you had to age it a little bit to marry the stuff. He was serious about his stuff, but he thought wine sucked. So red wine sucked. Anyway, in 20, what was it, 2001 and 2 vintages, I had, when I did my blending trials for Old and Mature Vine Zin, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't want to fit in there. It was this, one year had too much structure, the other one didn't have enough. So I just parked them on the side, extra stuff on the side pocket. I said, well, I'll deal with this later. And then I come along and I'm looking at leftovers from 2 different vintages, and I go, oh my God, you know, one's lacking, one's got more. And I put them together and it was magic. And I go, well, shit, I got to put these together, you know. And well, what am I going to call it? And I thought Zindos, right, you know, and have a version number, but I thought Microsoft might not find that too cool. I mean, I could do a special labeling for them or something, but Zinfandel seemed to make sense. And then having the batch number tells us what vintages are in it, you know, which Zinfandel it is. But the mission of Zinfandel is just to be delicious. I want to, you know, mop up everything. I want everything in the cellar to find a home that tastes really good. And so I'll slide things around with the blends and find homes for things. You know, since I have Syrah and Grenache in house, sometimes a little of that finds its way into it. Not always, sometimes. And so it's non-vintage Zinfandel. I put Sonoma County, even though probably Alexander Valley would be, and even Scherrer Vineyard in many vintages would be appropriate and legal. I keep the net really wide to keep my options open. But yeah, it's just a delicious wine. We sell a lot of it to people for weddings because, you know, they're having a banquet or something, and people are enjoying each other so much, but they want to have actually a real wine. They don't want candy. And it's, you know, the price point's good for that. And yeah, they age pretty well, actually. I was dug through my library and I've got a couple older batches. And actually, when it was in Hawaii, we had I think it was 16.7 or 14.5, you know, they still had some of that in the warehouse. And so we did something with that. And it was delicious. You know, it's just like they hang out and do the thing. But that's the mission of Zinfandel, is to be delicious. And wine snobs are not going to go for it. Oh, hell with them, you know. They're not going to go for non-vintage California wine anyway. So we'll give a name that evokes a little bit of fun. It has nothing to do with the dogs, you know, the Labrador, stuff like that.
When did you release the first version of it?
That would have been in 2003 or 4.
Okay, yeah.
Will that wine snob start their high-end pairing dinner with non-vintage champagne and end with non-vintage port?
Oh, but that's different.
Oh, okay, okay. One thing for selling it, one piece that I found effective in presenting it is this is the omelet that you make after you cooked a really fancy dinner. And it's hard to know whether the omelet was as good or better than the dinner, because you paid a lot of money for the steak, you paid a lot of money for the fine mushrooms, and then the next morning, with no pressure, you just have an omelet and you have incredible ingredients, which is the old and mature vines. And you make the omelet where you're now in a situation with no pressure, you're just hungry. And the only thing the omelet should do is be delicious. And man, is it ever delicious. And I find that buyers respond to that because we've all been there. We've all tried to do something fancy and then had a leftover and not known which one was better. And I'm careful not to present that to the detriment of the old and mature vine, but just to say the ingredients you're working with here are absolutely world-class. But it has a name that might not key you into that unless you're in the know. And if you're in the know, now you got a glass pour, you have banquet wine, you have an option that's great. So.
And it also gives me permission to be really rigorous on the old and mature vines in, you know, because I have another place to put this stuff. It's not like, oh God, I'm going to have to bulk this out. Well, we'll just slip it in here. It's like, oh, fuck it. I'll find another home for it, you know? yeah, we don't make as much money on it, but I think it's good for the brand in general, you know, to have people drinking your wine more often.
So we're moving into the 2018 Old and Mature Vine. Walk us through, if you would, the old vines here. Tell us the story of first of the site going back as far as you know, and then we'll get to the 18 vintage.
My great grandfather bought this site in 1899. The house was built in 1853. It was a second house in Alexander Valley, but he bought it in 1899, moved from Windsor in the Russian River Valley, moved the family up here. And there were some vines, own-rooted vines up here, and they died. And so did my great-grandfather. He died, probably cancer, something got him pretty young. So my grandfather left school after 8th grade and took over the farming. And when he was 21, he planted the old vines that we have in here. So in 10, 11, or yeah, 11, 12, and 13, he planted some vineyards, you know, several acres of vineyards. This is 3.34 acres of stuff that he planted back then. Head trained, spur pruned, 8 foot by 8 foot, because that's how they're either on 7 foot centers or 8 foot centers around here when they used horses to plow. It depended on whether you had 2 small horses in a team or just 2 horses, one in front of the other, or just 1 horse, depending on what you're trying to drag through the vineyard. But you know, it's a good spacing. They're dry farmed. Most of the vines are still that original planting, but my grandfather would replant with other things. There's some Alicante Boucher, a little bit of Petit Boucher, and Petit Syrah in there, but it's a tiny proportion. It's way less than 1% is non-Zinfandel, and I think that that's one reason that it's so delicate. I think Zinfandel itself has a delicate side to it. So many of these old vineyards have a large proportion of these later, more tannic varieties in there that really does mark the weight, you know, of the wine and the broodiness of the wine. They may have to wait a little longer for these later, more tannic varieties to ripen enough to for the wine to be really good. So then the alcohol levels tend to be higher. But I think with ours, I see delicacy in Zinfandel. It's got a, you know, delicate skin at the right time. There's just a plurality of fruits and things like that. So that's the old vines and mature vines. Starting in the early 70s, we started pulling out 2 or 3 acre blocks of prune trees that were actually doing very well long time ago as a crop, but the market had collapsed for that in the 60s. So a decade later, my grandfather realized it was time to start switching over to the other crop locally that was starting to actually make some money. So every 2 or 3 years, we'd pull out a 2 or 3 acre block of orchard and put in the vineyard. Since it was the 3 of us were the labor crew, we could only do 2 or 3 acres at a time. There's a whole lot of effort involved in, you know, you pull the trees out, pick the roots out, rip it again, pull the roots out, pull the big rocks out, disc it, pull the rocks out, you know, the big rocks to get in the way. When you plant the vines now, there's a lot of tying and training going on. And then once you get them kind of established, now you can go tackle another block. So that's why we kind of do it piecemeal, a couple acres at a time. We weren't clued in or hip to clones at the time, so we bought some stuff from the nurseries. One of the blocks, Frank Toldeski grafted it because we just planted rootstock, and he came in and field budded it, and he grabbed some budwood from his own vineyard out in Dry Creek. So we probably have different clones in here. I'm not sure how important that is. They all kind of look the same, but you know, I think the differences are more soil based than anything.
So speaking of the plant material and how you were maybe less aware in the 70s, 80s of how you would be now, what do you know about the plant material that your grandfather might have got as a 21-year-old dealing just post phylloxera? So that's a really interesting time in the world of wine to be planting.
Yeah. You know, the legend is that that the plants came in barrels with sawdust in them from France. I don't know that the Zinfandel came from France, but you know, somewhere in Europe, I guess, right, or somewhere far away. But that was the legend. that they came. But they were in barrels with, you know, moist sawdust in them, and then it took a while for those plants to become established, because they're dry farm. They didn't have a way to water them in, and so if you have in those days, you'd dig a hole in the wintertime, put it in there, tamp the soil around the roots, and then hopefully you'd get enough rainfall through the year that plant would actually have enough water to, you know, grow a reasonably a good bit to establish itself. But the rootstock that we were using, that most people around here used, was Vitis rupestris St. George, which has a tendency to want to plunge down and go deep for the nutrients and water. That's its way to function. You know, there's other rootstocks that don't do that, but they're much better at dealing with very dry root tips. The St. George actually doesn't do well with dry root tips, but it'll go down, and if you got the right soil, it can go down and explore the soil thoroughly and get to the moisture that it needs for the year. But it takes them a few years to get established that way.
So the roots, the plant material makes for a lovely bit of a comparison, because your grandfather, as a 21-year-old, planted the vines that are now 113 years old, but he planted in 1910, 11, 12. And then, if I'm not mistaken, when you and your dad planted in the 70s, that was just before he passed in, because the recording of him is in 78. So he was with you when you were planting the mature vines?
Yes. Yeah. Not all of them, but most of them. He passed in January of 1980, a few days after his 89th birthday.
Where does your mind go when you think about, or what can you tell us about that, about planting with him, having, you know, a guy who planted those vines and working with him at that point? Where did your mind go in that reflection?
Well, it was really neat because, you know, he had a lot of experience doing this stuff, and he would help other people plant their vineyards all around. You know, but everybody helped each other, right? They were all neighbors, and, you know, everybody had expertise. And so it's almost like raising a barn, right? You know, for your neighbors, but somebody's planting, you know, you go over there, everybody kicks in and gets the job done. And I remember him sitting on a bucket. You know, it's one of these 5-gallon, well, it was basically oil drum, 5-gallon oil thing that the top got taken out. So then we would use it as a bucket, but he'd turn it over and that was a Scherrer. And then he'd trim the roots of these little things. And he'd grab his hand around the roots that would come off of the stick and cut everything else off. So one hand width. And then he would thin things out a little bit, so that then when you plant it, you push it down into the bottom of the hole and put some dirt around it, but then you would pull the plant up. So, you know, as the roots are like this, and you pull it up so that they're kind of facing down, but they're also outward of each other. And there's a defect in planting vines that has been committed so much here in the last 30 or 40 years. Is called J-rooting, where they don't trim the roots. They go, oh no, we'll just leave all these roots. They you know, stick them down in the hole, and they're all kind of tangled on each other. And then after a decade or so, those roots start girdling themselves. You know, they've instead of grafting into each other, they've girdled themselves, and the vines start to decline. So we saw a lot of that at Kick Ranch, actually, in the Grenache, which is why one of the blocks got pulled out, because the J-rooting really it hurt the productivity of the block, and they didn't want to just replant a few of the vines, or half of them, half that were J-rooted. But you know, he had his way of doing it, right? And this is what you do. We would hill them in. You know, you buy your plants in the wintertime, and then we dig a trench under the fig tree, kind of in the coolest part of the yard, and then put the plants in there, and then basically bury them and put some burlap over them. And that way we would wait till the soil warmed up in May, you know, mid to late May, and then go ahead and plant them. That way, once the plants go out there, the soil's warm, and stuff's going to happen. And we got all of our friends and neighbors to collect their used milk cartons for us, because then we would put that around the plant to keep the rabbits from munching at the little shoots. So then we would tie them religiously to the stakes. Now that way, if the shoot tip isn't hanging out there, the rabbits aren't going to be as attracted to them and eat them. They keep coming back and eating them again and again. It really stunts the vines. So as a teenage boy, I had the greatest time. The neighbors, my family didn't pay me, but the neighbors would pay me $0.25 every rabbit that I shot. So I'd go out in their vineyards and shoot rabbits. Depending on how close to the highway was, I'd either use the shotgun or a 22. But we had a lot of rabbits around in those days. There was a huge population of them. So, and the small ones.
Go ahead.
I'm saying the small ones are pretty good eating. A little bit of some refined Chianti.
So 2018 OMV, jumping from 1970 to 2018. Could you walk us through how you make this wine, and along the way maybe highlight if you've made changes to how you made it and why, and what that gives you, and how we get to what we have in the glass now?
The early few vintages, I actually was still interested in whole clusters, that carbonic maceration thing, and my pressing regime hadn't been fine-tuned. So I was adding some whole clusters. The problem is that, you get all the green stuff and all the green stuff, or the green and raisins, and you get all the stem as well. So that's all a little bit of noise that gets into there. So I quit doing that, and now it's all destemmed gently, and to try to get rid of the outliers, to really truncate that the overripe and underripe stuff. And then it's in, just like Pinot Noir, it's in and the Cab, everything essentially, open top tanks. I punch them down. I actually just work the top a little bit before stuff really gets moving, because I don't want to molest the berries. I want some whole berries in there, but I want to make the dry stuff wet up on the top. And then once it starts fermenting, then we'll punch it a little bit, and then when that's essentially a fermenter's a compost pile, right? It's getting good and hot in the middle, and so then we want to spread that hot spot out amongst the edges. That keeps the yeast from killing themselves. Essentially, they'll overheat and kill the fermentation. So then we'll maybe do it twice a day when it gets really raging, and then we'll go back to once a day just to mix it up. And then thereafter, it's pretty much once a day. After the stuff's dry, we'll stir it up. Even pull the lees and the dead yeast and the muddy stuff up from the bottom, and then I take a sample with a Chinese strainer, spin it down in a lab centrifuge to taste it clearly, to see where we are in maceration. Is it nearly done? Has it got a ways to go? And then put a tarp over there and blow a little CO2 snow on it to minimize or lessen the amount of oxygen contact, so it can really extend that maceration a hell of a long time. So we're getting an interesting cacophony of different things going on. We're still extracting more stuff slowly through this cooled, dry mass of meaning no sugar, mass of grapes sitting there. We're getting a fining, and it's almost a bâtonnage of the whole fermentation. So we're getting a fining process going on with the proteinaceous parts and the tannins that are coming out. We're getting a little oxidation and polymerization of some of the phenolics in there. So there's all this stuff is going on, and the whole idea is to let this thing kind of come to completion, and a kind of a rounding of the entire package. And then once that's in sight, then we'll take a look at pressing it, where we can continue that refinement.
And then the barrel program?
It goes to barrel 1 or 2 days after I've pressed it. It depends on how deep the tank is, how long it'll take some of those heavier solids to settle out. And barrels are totally dependent on what the lot is, what it wants. I employ a type of a puncheon. I think I'm the only person in the U.S. that gets this puncheon. It was made by Terrenceau for Grenache. Jean-Pierre Giraud used to be the sales manager for Terrenceau, and when he found out I was making Grenache back in 2012, he goes, "Oh, you must use my puncheon for this." And I go, "Dude, I don't like new oak in my Rhone varieties." He goes, "No, you must get some of these." So I got a couple, but I used them in Zinfandel, and I said later on, broke them in Zinfandel, then I would use them on Grenache, which is perfect, because and I said, "Jean-Pierre, this is not a Grenache puncheon. This is a Zinfandel puncheon that also can be used for Grenache once it's broken in, but it's stunning for it." So it's a reference 555 is the 500-liter puncheon for that. But it's really, really good with that. But I'll use some of that in the traditional size barrels, and it depends on the vintage, what types of new oak I will use and how much. It's somewhere between 25 and 40%, maybe 50% in a rare case, you know, and whether it's Burgundy type oak or the cognac type barrel, it really depends on the fit and finish. So I typically try to buy more barrels than I need so that I have that flexibility, you know, that I can grab whatever I think I need to balance that, because you can't just go down to the barrel store usually, you know, the day before you need it and get them.
And how long will it live in the barrel?
As long as I can get away with the older Mature Vine Zin, I bottled that when it's about 18 months old or so. You know, I'm selling futures on this was my financing vehicle that got the winery started. So I tend to do that, you know, still. So I'll bottle it in the same bottle it in the, not the following March, but the March or so after, and then ship it out to people. But I bottled some other lots of Zinfandel, you know, some of the things that I didn't sell futures on much later, and they like it too. So I think somewhere between 1 and 2 years is a pretty good spot. Between 2 and 3 is a really good spot too, depending on how much of the non-fruit element you're looking for.
Is the 2018 unique with this sort of really light fruited, ethereal kind of top of the nose? It's showing beautifully. This is the first time we're tasting it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that unique, or is that something we should expect in older Mature Vine?
Something you should expect. 19 is a lot like that. 17, which you've had, you know, is kind of like that too. But what happens is, you know, you get a couple more years on these things. So by the time you get to 16, 15, 14, 13 vintages, you get more of a perfume thing coming back out again, which I find fascinating. But yeah, I think this, a little more delicacy and layers to it. I've learned it with Zinfandel. I keep reminding myself of this every year. It's like, you know, if I feel like this stuff could have hung out on the vine another day or two, that means I got it at the right time. You know, if I'm just like, well, maybe I could have picked this a day or two later, that means that I picked it right on the early side of my range. And I've been rewarded for that. Every time I felt that way, it's been a reward in the long run.
And so you mentioned going back in the Zinfandel, we certainly have shared experience drinking your wines. Your Zins back over 25 plus years. The question that buyers are going to be, there's an assumption a lot of buyers are coming into with Zinfandel, where you're either have been fortunate enough to taste what people call old school Zin and had older things at age, or you're sort of stuck in your exposure to Zinfandel being very high alcohol and not really worth cellaring. Yours is quite different. Can you talk about aging Zin and how you see it as a grape? Because I don't think buyers all see it the same way.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the problem with what's happened to Zinfandel is that there's this modus operandi of, yeah, you got to pick this, got to be jammy, you know, and big and round and all that stuff. And it doesn't have to be. You could do that to any variety, really. And it gets done to a lot of varieties, unfortunately. But there's a sameness to that, right? So why even put a vineyard designation on it if it's going to taste like something else from any place else, you know? But I think there's oxygen appetite. Wine's got oxygen appetite, and it gets it from the types of phenols that it's got. And there's a turnover in those as the grape ripens. When it goes from underripe to overripe, you know, you've got big repellents, right? And I don't want to get into the whole, you know, reason to make grapes is sex, right? And you repel from birds moving the seeds until the seed's viable, and then all these processes happen, right, to make it more attractive to the birds. And winemakers are kind of like birds anyway. But so we get to pick where we want to grab the grapes at that point. You know, do we want a lot of the repellents or the harshness, that the high, brighter acidity and harder tannins, and greener flavors? Do we want to go with the extreme to have the softer tannins that don't have that oxygen appetite, darker fruits, you know, more carbohydrate, more higher sugar, more alcohol in the resulting wine? But where in that continuum do we want to be? And I think there's a really happy medium in here where we get some beautiful plurality of flavors, and we've got the oxygen appetite that the wine will stay intact a long time, and it will actually develop bottle bouquet and some other, you know, interesting secondary, tertiary characteristics. So you've added, but by doing that, you've added to the wine. It's an additive process, not necessarily a trade-off. So just don't pick the stuff overripe; it'll age better. You pick it way underripe, it'll age forever, and nobody will ever drink it. So there, you gotta catch it at the right time. But
We will now Corvin, keep ranch Grenache, or do Grenache first or Cab?
I think we could have first.
Okay. So interestingly, it's worth noting, we did the Grenache at Vistro and before the Cab, and sold equal amounts of both. Grenache in a lineup is interesting to grab people's attention. I think before, I'm not quite sure I have a really good working theory on that, but it worked well in that lineup because it got people's attention, because you go Pinot, Grenache, and it was like a jump where people saw it. So just a thought for us as a team, one way or the other, but again, really thinking about order and how you're showing, and you can try with Jim later of what do you do?
Yeah.
How are we doing on time? You need to.
It's part of it. Yeah, it's breathing in. Too. It's fine.
Yep. 2018 Alexander Cab. We also have, of course, the Sher Vineyard Cab. Walk us through your cab program, if you would.
so it's all the same clone of Cabernet, probably clone 7. My dad got it from Robert Young, an old friend of his. They grew up together. And so at that time, that's probably all they had was clone 7. And Bob recommended it to my dad, who was looking for some Cabernet. And Bob said, well, it seems to be clean from virus. It yields well, and the winemakers seem to like it. There you go. Farmer logic, right? All the good stuff. So we planted, or my dad planted a couple acres, 2.5 acres, in 1 year on St. George rootstock, which is what we always planted our stuff on. And then a few years later, he wanted to plant 2 more blocks like that. And the nursery couldn't, there's a planting boom in the early 90s. The nursery couldn't come up with what my dad ordered for St. George. However, he had 2 new rootstocks, 140 Rougerie and 1103 Paulson. And my dad didn't know what to do. He asked me. I was actually studying rootstocks at the time. There's so much literature out there, but there were conflicts between results. And there were conflicts were because of misnomers. People would they thought it was 110R, but it was actually 99R, or there was a viral disease, so there's incompatibilities and stuff. So you had to look at which results you need to not look at, in South Africa or in France or wherever, to try to make sense of it all, because it didn't make any sense. And I'd spent about 1.5 years studying that already. So I suggested to my dad that the Rougerie would probably be most like the St. George that we knew and loved, and it would probably be the most appropriate of the 2. So he planted that. But I said, since we've got foreign shit in here, Dad, let's do a rootstock trial. Let's do like 5 different rootstocks and do a row of each one. And then, we can see what we want to plant next time. And he goes, well, I won't be here next time. And I said, yeah, but I hope to be. That way we'll really know what the wine's going to be like. So after those were 10 years old, I know this is a tangent, but after they were 10 years old, I had bought 5 different new 30-gallon barrels. I broke them in on something else. They were all the same. I vinified each of those rows separately 2 years in a row, and it was shocking how different they all were. They're adjacent rows. The soil's the same clone. I picked them at different times. I picked them when I thought it would make the best wine, but it was shocking how different, and it had nothing to do with the yields, the relative qualities. Anyway, the 2 rootstocks are very different, and the soil's very little bit, so they make different kind of wine. The Rougerie makes a wine that seems to rely a little more on acidity than tannin for its angles, and it has a little more red fruit to it typically, and a little more of an herbal side to it, a little more of that cassis thing. Whereas the Scherrer Vineyard bottling tends to have a little bit more tannin, which then resolves, over time and becomes just a little more unctuous, and it has more broody, mysterious things going on with it. The 2 don't really blend well together, so they needed to go to separate buckets. And I feel like this channels Alexander Valley, that red fruit thing and deliciousness more so than the Scherrer Vineyard. I think it's a little more food friendly, a little wider range of stuff because of the little higher acidity and red fruit thing that goes on. I mean, it'll work for traditional cab things quite well, but I think it's a little more versatile actually. If I was smart, I would call this Scherrer Vineyard and the other one Reserve or Super Orgasmic, whatever, you know. But I'm not that smart.
That is an interesting thing to frame these. And I'm not either. I've never framed them specifically as a reserve. But I think you can very easily find your way into that language to explain that somebody else may have done that. And I think you can do that, especially if you have told the story in the lineup of the old and mature and how careful you are with naming things very literally. Because you have some of the oldest Zinfandel vines in the world. Without much hyperbole saying that, certainly many of the oldest in the Alexander Valley. And you can demonstrate how careful and how literal you are with naming. So now you would roll in, and if you were showing them side by side, or if you were talking about the Scherrer Vineyard, so here's the reserve, here's what somebody else may call the reserve, and go from there. Way to frame it that I haven't thought about before.
Yeah, you know, I could call them like Cote, you know, Noir and Cote Rouge or something like that, right? Both Scherrer Vineyard, because they do have different expressions. But I was being more simple about the whole thing. So, and it gives me the opportunity to, you know, let's say if I wanted to grab a little Merlot from our next door neighbor sometime, you know, I could play around with that. I haven't, but I adore this pure expression of Cabernet actually.
And then your barrel on this is very long at this point.
Yeah, it's you know, 4 years, no racking.
Why do you refer to that as Burgundian?
Yeah, I guess it is. You know, you put it in the barrel, leave it until you're done, I guess. You know, there's this idea with Cabernet, you have to rack it a bunch of times, but I think that's an old tradition. That's the way they used to get SO2 into those wines. You know, you'd rack them quarterly. So if you didn't, they would go bad because you get Brettanomyces or something going in there. So then what they do is they rack it, gas the barrels, burn a sulfur wick in them, and then the next day or 2 days later, you put the wine in there. Well, then the SO2 goes from the barrel into the wine, but importantly, it kind of fumigates the barrel. So that was the gestalt, right? Is to make, of course, that you make higher quality wines doing that. But I think just leave them alone. I've done that slowly and methodically, you know, experiments. But I've just found that if I don't go to a barrel with really thick solids, it can sit on those a long time, and it's good for it. They like it in the long run.
If you don't go to barrel with thick solids, you said.
Yeah, if I go, pardon me, if you go with really light solids, basically your yeast, those are the ones you want because they actually get back to the wine. They give some texture. The thicker solids can get funky. You know, stuff will rot in there. You've got a thicker layer of things, and it's not in contact with the wine. Pardon me.
We have used all of your battery power on this round of virus. I think. Amazing. Well, you know, Fred, I think we'll stop here. Let you catch your breath. I know Stephen's going to need to run. Always a pleasure and just so fascinating. So thanks for your time. Thanks for your support, and we look forward to selling some more of your wine.
Likewise, I love your questions. They're really, yeah, you're paying attention. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Fred.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Fred.
Bye, guys.